All right, good afternoon, class. I'm Dr. James Gilly, and I'm going to be your professor for this course. What we're going to be doing today is digging deep into some definitions, right? Getting some nice historical framework and information about the founding of the United States and how that impacts the institutions that we created moving forward. So today, this is the first lecture of our 11 lecture series on American politics. So this is really going to be doing a lot of setting the groundwork, getting us set up for understanding the institutions that come forth based on American politics. So let's go ahead and dive right in. The first thing we're going to do is I want to give you a brief overview of what we're going to be doing in this class. This class is a very basic introduction to American politics. Now, my background is comparative politics, So we're going to be looking at America almost as if it's an example of a comparative course, So we're going to be looking at the unique history and culture that have created our American institutions, So the things that we're going to be focusing on in this course are the institutions of governance, How we actually built the institutions that govern our country. We're also going to be looking at we got a kind of a character arc, if you will, of America, of the selection of leadership, how our culture leads into the way that we build our parties and institutions, and then finally how that we actually go about selecting our leaders. So I got a little something there. We're then going to look at the policy making process, How a bill becomes a law within the institutions that we have created, as well as how we go about fighting tyranny, how we separate our powers, that's kind of the key feature that America is really big into, is the separation of powers and the checks and balances within our system. So we're going to be focusing very heavily on that, That's going to kind of undergird everything that we're talking about within this course. And finally, we're going to wrap up this course by looking at foreign policy, How the U.S. interacts with the rest of the world. So we've got a lot of interesting things to be examining over the course of the next several weeks, over the course of our 11 lecture series here. So let's go ahead and dive on in. So today, the first thing we're really going to be doing is examining some definitions, making sure we're all on the same page, using the same words in the same ways. And we have a series of definitions that we have that I want to make sure we're all using together, because these are words that are going to keep cropping up, terms that are going to keep cropping up over the course of the semester. We're going to use them over and over again. So I want to make sure that we're using them properly from the beginning. So the first four terms that you see here, are nation, country, state, and government. They are very heavily intertwined with each other, almost to the extent that we conflate them, We use them in place of one another in everyday usage. But within this course, and hopefully moving forward, I will be able to get you all using these terms appropriately, properly, the way that they're meant to be used. So our first term is nation, Our first definition that we really need to make sure we have clear is nation, So when I say a nation, what I'm talking about are a group of people, So when I say nation, you should immediately think a group of people. These are a group of people that are tied together by bonds of history and culture. They might have a common language, common customs, common, something that holds them in common. This course, we're at Nichols State University, deep down south, Louisiana, deep into Cajun country, And we could think of the Cajuns themselves as a nation of people, any group of people that has some sort of bond that ties them together, That's a nation. Now, we in the United States, we consider ourselves to be one nation, And this is because of the bonds of history, but we don't have necessarily, we're almost a nation of many nations, That's one of the kind of unique things that America has going for it, There's a whole bunch of these different groups of people with common linkages together, So this nation is going to be really important to understanding a lot of the things that go on in American politics. And the core thing that I want you to remember here is with the word nation, right? We're talking about a group of people. Right? That's how we're going to be using nation. Moving on, right? Our second term is country. Now, when I say country, right, I'm referring to something very specific. I'm referring to a piece of land, right? A land with a border, with boundaries. So this is a little bit different than how we might colloquially use country, right? So when I say country, think geography, think land, right? Within the United States, right, it itself is one country in the world, but it also contains a multitude of countries, right? Every state of the United States is actually a country, right? It has geographic boundaries, right? So this is going to be really important, right? So nation, people. State, well, we haven't gotten to state yet. Country, land. State is a little bit different, right? This is, again, one of those different usages. Now, within American politics, we talk about the states, if you will, right? The 50 states. But what these are, right? When I use the word state, what I'm talking about is the actual institutions that govern a country, right? So the state of Louisiana, when I say the state of Louisiana or the state of Washington, right, that does refer to land, but also I'm going to really try to keep the term state tied to this notion of governing, right, governance institutions, a constitution, a judiciary, an executive, a legislature, a body of laws, right, a bureaucracy, police, military force, right? So when I'm talking about a state, what we're dealing with is some sort of administrative body. So a nation is people. A country is land. A state, that is an administrative unit. That's institutions. So then you're probably wondering, well, right, that state sounds an awful lot like how we normally use government. So what is a government going to be? Well, for us, what a government will be are the actual people themselves that run the state, right? So when I say, right, who are the government? Not what is the government, but I'm very much going to try to keep it to who are the government. So in the state of Louisiana right now, in the year 2019, the government is John Bel Edwards and everyone who's been elected. The government of the United States is Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi and all of the members of the executive branch and the judicial branch and the legislative branch, right? A government are a who that administer the state. And a state itself runs a country that contains a group of people, right? So people living on land, having institutions that administer them, and then the government are the people that actually run those institutions. Now, all of this is tied together with our fifth term, which is sovereignty. So sovereignty is this notion of ultimate, right, decision-making ability, ultimate responsibility for some land, for some area. Now, there's a very complicated relationship between people and their sovereignty and where sovereignty comes from that we're actually going to investigate much more heavily throughout the course of this semester. But just for right now, what you need to know about sovereignty is that it is the ultimate decision-making authority, right? Where it's vested, right? Traditionally, right, over the last 500 or so years, it has been vested, right? Sovereignty rests within the state, right? And particularly the nation state, right? This idea of a state tied to a particular nation of people that live in a particular country. So all five of these terms that we've been dealing with right now are intertwined with each other, but they're not the same thing. They all have a distinct meaning, right? The words themselves have a particular meaning. So at this point, I want to make sure we're all just going to be using these in the same way. So to recap, a nation is a group of people. A country is a land with a boundary. A state is a set of institutions that administer, right, that run a nation and a country. The government are the actual individuals that run the state. So it's a who are the government, not a what is the government. And all of this is tied together with the ultimate decision-making authority that is sovereignty. So I hope that's clear. If not, please feel free to send me a message. I'll dig deeper into that. So our second set of definitions have very much to do with the politics, right, and ideological beliefs within this system. Got to keep the whistle wet to be able to speak to you. So our first ideology, and right, these ideologies, we're going to look at them in both a global context and an American context, because in the particular American sense, we use these words differently than the rest of the world. But there is a particular historical context that explains why that is. So our first term for ideologies is liberal. Right? And if you've had any of that schoolboy Latin that they don't ever teach anymore, right, you would know that the word liber, the Latinate root of the word liber, means freedom. So liberal and liberalism is an ideology concerning freedom, and this is both individual and personal freedoms, right, as well as an economic dimension of freedom as well. Right? This is the government staying out of your bedroom and boardrooms, freedom in the economy, freedom in social life, which is much closer to, right, the American term libertarian that we'll get to in a minute. But in the global context, right, that's what liberal means. Pro-free market, pro-social choices. Right? Now in America, due to some historical developments, right, for us, liberal is much closer to the term progressive used throughout the rest of the world, right? So it's much more about progress and social change in a way that we will be attempting to move things forward, right? So in the American context, liberal means progressive, and in the liberal the international context, liberal means freedom of economic behavior and freedom of social behavior, personal freedom. Now, because of the quirks of American history, right? Again, that term liberal that we've been throwing around might actually be a little bit closer to the way that we actually use conservative here in America, but we're going to get to that in a second. Right? So conservative is to conserve, right? So conservatism in the international sense is a political philosophy all about maintaining tradition, maintaining traditional social orders and power arrangements. Right? So in most cases, this will be, right, conservatives will be like pro-monarchy or kind of pro-traditionalism. But in the United States, our traditional power arrangements are that of liberalism, right? That of free markets and free minds and free people. So when we use conservative in the United States, it might be a little bit closer to a traditional global definition of liberal. And when we use liberal in the United States, we mean much more of a progressive or kind of a democratic socialist sort of answer. Which leads us to our next thing, which is socialist. Right. This one we're actually going to keep fairly simple. We're going to use the very traditional definition of socialism, which is a government that's concerned with equality and also about ownership, right? The state itself owning the means of production, right? So that's what we're going to stick with for socialist, is this owning of the means of production. But generally speaking, the reason why they would want to do that is for a political ideology being concerned with equality. So liberal is an ideology, internationally speaking, of personal choice in economy and in social life. A conservative is trying to maintain a traditional value, and a socialist in the international sense is about a government seizing the means of production in order to foster equality. On the American scale, however, right, liberal is going to be about progressivism. Conservatism is going to be about traditional values, but these traditional values are what we would normally think of as free markets and free social choices. And socialism is again going to be about pro-equality, but also about the government seizing the means of production. So, our final American definition is libertarian, which is much closer to the international political ideology of liberalism. So again, in America, libertarians, free markets, free minds. Pro-choice economically and socially, right? Choosing to be free trade and also, freedom of human action. Right? So that's what libertarian is going to be, much closer to the international definition of liberal. Right? So those ideologies are the main sorts of ideologies that run through American politics. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that in the weeks to come. But for right now, I just want to make sure we're all using those all in the same way. Water. It's cool, it's crisp, it's delicious. Okay, here's our next set of definitions that I want to make sure we all have, right? And we're using the same way. The main one that I'm talking about here is rational. And what rational means is that you have preferences, and two, these preferences carry over. So the way that works is, well, what I have illustrated right below the word rational. A is greater than B, B is greater than C. So therefore, A is also greater than C. Now, what does this mean? Right, that's kind of like right, formal logic way of putting this. What it really means is that you like stuff, and then the way that you like stuff carries over, right? So if A were to be hamburgers, and B were to be hot dogs, and C were to be pizza, then therefore, I like hamburgers more than I like hot dogs, and I like hot dogs more than I like pizza. So therefore, I like hamburgers more than I like pizza. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with being sane, right? This doesn't have anything to do with clear decision making. This just means that you have preferences and they carry over, right? So if I prefer hamburgers to hot dogs and hot dogs to pizza, right, that carries over. That is rational. Now, is that necessarily logical? Probably not, because we all know that pizza is actually better than hot dogs. And right, there could be a debate about whether you like pizza more than hamburgers. But at the end of the day, it's definitely clear that logically speaking, right, pizza is better, right? It is empirically better than hot dogs. But if you have the preference choice that you like hamburgers more than hot dogs and hot dogs more than pizza, that is still rational because you have your preferences and those preferences are transferable, right? They carry over. So that's what we're going to use when we mean rational. It doesn't have anything to do with logic. It doesn't have anything to do with sanity. It's just about having preferences and that those preferences carry over. We also have written here institution, right? So I've already used this word a decent amount today. But when I'm saying institution, what I'm getting at are both formal and informal structures of organizing power and behavior. That's it, right? So a formal institution would be something like the Federal Bureau of Investigation or Nicholls State University, right? Whereas an informal institution would be something like a cultural norm, like it's weird to like hot dogs more than pizza, right? That is some sort of governance structure out there, right? It's an informal like norm or value, right? So an institution could be both formal, like a brick and mortar institution, or informal, like norms and rules, or unwritten rules, right? And both of these are ways, right? Both of these formal or informal institutions, right? Bodies of behavior regulate how we do things, right? They regulate behavior and action. So that's all we're talking about when we're talking about an institution. So I hope that's fairly clear for us right now. All right. So let's get into it, right? Now that we have some definitions that we can all work with, right? Let's get into the actual history that led up to the creation of the Declaration of Independence and then what followed on after we won this war, right? What sort of institutions we created immediately following our successful separation from the United Kingdom, right? It's called the Articles of Confederation, and why they were not so great and ended up eventually leading to the creation of the Constitution that we have today, right? Making us rethink the way our governmental structures to end up with the Constitution we have today. So, to start, we need to look at the world as it was in the year 1760. So in the year 1760, the United Kingdom, right, England predominantly, was the main global force of power. They had just come off of a series of civil wars in the continent and a particular civil war within their own country. They have been at war on and off against France, both on the continent and on North American continent, for about 60 to 70 years at this point, off and on. There have been a series of wars fought between England and France. And these wars themselves have been really kind of expensive, right? Going to war is an expensive proposition. Even if you win, right, there is a large cost associated with that. So both England and France, during these conflicts, took out a large series of loans from various bankers across the European continent. And what we see is that even upon victory, right, even though the British won and were able to capture Canada, right, the Canadian provinces held by France, what we see is that they really are in a financial strait, right? They need to be able to repay their war debts. And by 1760, right after the 7 Years' War, right, the war between England and France, right, or as we call it here in America, the French and Indian War, right, it's all the same conflict. At the end of this war, the English are victorious, and King George III sits on the throne. But one of the problems that King George has is he has these massive war debts that he needs to repay, right? These payments are coming due. It's kind of like student loans. You have to repay these things or bad things are going to happen. So King George III looks around, right? And what he sees is a prosperous North American civilization that he happens to be the sovereign of, right? In the intervening period of about 1660 to 1760, roughly speaking, right, that rough 100-year period, the British Empire pretty much left the United States alone, right, their North American colonies alone to develop however they were going to develop. So in that period of freedom where we were essentially on this continent left to be, we develop a rather flourishing economy, society, right? We become a full-blown civilization, a new instance of English-style civilization on a new continent. But we'd gotten really used to being left alone, for the most part. And at the same time, right, by the time the 1760s rolls around, there's a new ideology that begins to float around. And it's this ideology called Enlightenment liberalism. Right? It comes predominantly out of Scotland, but also has heavy influences from France. Right? And these ideas begin to flourish. Right? This idea of Enlightenment liberalism is that people should be left alone, right, to do what they want. Right? We should set up rules about how society should function. But for the most part, individuals should be allowed to choose how to live for themselves. And writ larger onto society, this means that people should be able to choose their own form of government. Or at the very least, they should be represented heavily within government. Well, with this political climate, right, spreading throughout the New World, it's very popular among the founding fathers, like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and John Jay and Thomas Paine and Alexander Hamilton, right? All of these founding fathers are being steeped in Enlightenment ideology and thinking about this. And what we see is that once King George III realizes that he has this civilization just sitting there waiting to pay back the war debts that he owes, right? He realizes that he can tax them, right? And not just tax their normal economic output, right? What he's really looking to tax are the things that they cannot make in the New World themselves, namely tea and ink and finished goods, large-scale finished goods, right? The United States simply cannot create these things. They have to import them legally from the British Empire. So they've decided to put a tax stamp on all of these things. Right? King George decides to tax the goods that are flowing into the American colonies. Right? So from this, what ends up happening is that while this taxation gets thrown onto the American people, right, or the nascent American people, what we see is that the ideologies of liberal enlightenment, right, enlightenment liberalism, begin to take root, and we begin to see reaction against these misdeeds by King George. And by 1774, it's become apparent that there is a distinct difference between American political values and British political values. Right? The Americans want to be represented. If they're going to be paying taxes, they want to be represented in Parliament by people that they themselves are electing. But King George, he didn't like this idea. What King George did is he believed, as was popular among many political theorists of the day within England, particularly Edmund Burke, right? He had this belief that all members of Parliament represented all British citizens, no matter where they were. Meaning that the political leaders in British Parliament, right, thousands of miles away across the ocean, right, in London, those members of Parliament would represent the interests of people living in Richmond, Virginia, or Boston, Massachusetts, or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Well, that notion just plain didn't fly. That dog didn't hunt. That was not acceptable for the Founding Fathers. So they began to write things, right? Thomas Paine, very right, famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death. No taxation without representation." Right? We believed that the only way that we could live and be represented properly was to actually separate ourselves from the British Empire. So in the middle of the 1770s, right, 1774, there were right, the beginnings of a conflict. 1775, we have the meeting of the Continental Congress, right, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, thinking about should we or should we not remain loyal British subjects. And the decision was made that no, we should not. We should rebel. We should separate ourselves from the British, right? That King George had committed crimes against the United States, and that we ourselves should well, we weren't even the United States then, right? He committed crimes against his own citizens, and that we needed to rebel and rise up and kick him out and take America for ourselves. So it came down to creating a Declaration of Independence, right? We know the Declaration of Independence, right? That we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, right? Thomas Jefferson, great writer, wrote these. Now, we know that, right, it's this notion that when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to sever the political bonds that have bound them to another, right? That it becomes necessary for people to end relationships that have been ongoing for centuries. There need to be reasons for this, and they need to deliberately tell those that they are leaving why they're doing it. So the Declaration of Independence laid out the case that King George had committed crimes against his own people. The notion is that, one, this would soften the hearts of the British citizens living in London, right, living throughout the rest of the empire, those that were living on the Great Isles of Great Britain, that they would be able to sway the support of their political leaders against King George, right? That they would leave King George, right? They would tell King George to leave us alone. So this was aimed at Parliament, right? King George was not an absolute monarch. He had to do what Parliament said. So King George, right, had to listen to the will of his people, right? His Parliament. That's what the Magna Carta said. So we laid out the crimes that he committed. We also showed these crimes to the rest of the world. We didn't just send this to King George. We sent this to Paris. We sent this to Germany. We sent this all over Europe so that we could gain support from other countries, or at the very least they would stay out of this conflict and let it just be between us and the British. Well, the French received this pretty well. Eventually they showed up to help us. But some of the crimes that King George committed, right, that it was said that King George committed and that the British Parliament committed, right, these are not crazy, antiquated ideas. Right? Let's look at some of them briefly. Let me list some of them for you. Some of these specific problems that King George did. It wasn't just that he was taxing us without allowing us representation, right? He refused to listen to the laws, right? Right. The way that we put it is that he refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He wouldn't allow new laws to be passed that would benefit his people, right? He forbid his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, right? Not governing was one of the chief things that happened here, right? In fact, he often suspended governors from being able to do things. He refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. So what that means is that he only allowed laws and representation to occur whenever the hell he wanted to, right? He was not allowing, right, proper representation. And when he did allow representation to occur, it was places that are very difficult for representatives to actually reach, meaning that we in America weren't allowed to send representatives to the UK. And he got rid of and reformed these houses quite regularly, right? These representative houses. He won't pass laws, right? That's a big problem. He won't allow people to actually go and move to states, right? He really heavily restricted immigration to the United States, and as well as buying new land and expanding the United States land itself. He wouldn't allow judges to do their jobs. He would basically tell judges how they would do their jobs. He created all sorts of new governmental organizations, new offices just to harass the people. He created standing armies without the consent of legislatures, right? So he put armies places where they hadn't even been voted on. He just willy-nilly put them where he wanted to. He actually took power of the military, right? He didn't let the military be under civilian power. That was a big problem at the day. He didn't allow trials to occur the way they were supposed to. He cut off trade between the United States and the rest of the world. The colonies and the rest of the world. That wasn't cool. No trial by juries, right? He got rid of a lot of those. So, right, these are very distinct political problems that really we see cropping up all over the world and even in America again today, right? So a lot of the political problems that were occurring back in the 18th century, they're not that different of political problems. These are things that quite often occur even through today. So, right, there were a lot of problems. So the Declaration of Independence went about crafting a bill of crimes that King George committed. So next time you look at the Declaration of Independence, read a little bit deeper, read more than just that preamble, and you can see that he committed very distinct political crimes against the people of the United States. And they were perhaps, and well, since we're all American, we can definitely say they were definitely in the right for having declared independence. So once they declared independence, King George sent in, oh, hey, that's all the stuff I was just saying. Right, sorry about that. So King George sent in his troops to fight against the Americans, right? To fight against his own people, right? So this was really the first time that a group of people had attempted to separate themselves from their political overlords, right? But this wasn't the only conflict the British were fighting, right? They were still embroiled in wars about secession of royal houses on the continent, as well as wars about global trade. So we saw a vast, right, political situation emerge for the British where they really were kind of being tugged in multiple directions. So just in fighting the United States, right, they were not, right, they were also engaged in other conflicts throughout the world. So once the war begins, what we see is that George Washington, trying to fight a very regularized military conflict, fight the way the British fight, didn't work, right? The British were better supplied, better trained, and just better at squashing rebellion than we were at fighting rebellion, right? We could not fight the way that they fought. So George Washington suffered massive losses from the beginning, and it was only when in the South, right, the southern parts, Georgia, Virginia, the Carolinas, only when those conflicts displayed more guerrilla tactics, more hit and run, right? Stick and move sort of surprise attacks. That was when we started to inflict heavy costs upon the British, right? It wasn't so much that we beat the British on the fields of battle, but it was more that the British realized it was not economically sensible to continue fighting this war. It became too expensive. They became too heavily involved. Sentiment for the war turned against them back home. So it was less that the British were defeated in this war, so much as that the British decided to quit fighting this war. They pulled out. They realized they had other imperial holdings they could go deal with. And when the French showed up at the Battle of Yorktown, right, helped resupply the traditional armies of George Washington, it was at that point that the British knew that the costs were too high and they left. They pulled out. It was over. So the world was turned upside down. The United States won. Well, I guess calling them the United States isn't quite right yet. The states that made up the former British colonies were victorious and shed themselves of their former political masters. So the question then becomes, what do you do? How do you govern this situation, right? How do you govern this political moment? How do you govern this new nation? This has never occurred before in history. So the question became, how do you set up a new political system when you have 13 independent states that know that they can only succeed working together? So in doing this, we created the Articles of Confederation. This is the first political document that governs our country, right? This is what actually creates the United States of America. And I say that in a very particular way, right? When I say the United States of America under the Articles of Confederation, I am putting the emphasis on the word states, not united. So United States of America. And that's going to be really, really important to understanding how this system worked, right? What the Articles of Confederation included were 13 particular rules or articles about how the United States of America were to function. So the very first of these articles creates the country, right? The Confederacy. The style of this Confederacy shall be, quote, the United States of America, end quote, right? Putting the emphasis on states. Article number 2, right, is really important, right? It asserts that each state itself will be sovereign, right? So the states themselves are the sovereign entity, creating a very weak centralized government, right? Article number 2 continues, right? Asserts the sovereignty of each state except for the specific powers delegated to the Confederation government, right? Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated. So the Articles of Confederation put all of the power in the states except for the very few things that they reserve for the centralized government. Right? These states, right? Article 3 goes on to say that these states enter into a league of union, very firm friendship with each other, so that they can have common defense, securing liberties, and promoting the general and mutual welfare, right? So they come together to offer each other assistance against all forces and attacks made upon them, right, on any sort of account, right? So this unites the states together essentially for mutual defense. So right now it's more of a mutual defense treaty, right, this Articles of Confederation, than any sort of true governance structure. Article number 4 says that there's going to be free movement of people between the states, right, excluding those who are right criminals between the states. They can be extradited, right, and that all people will have equal rights between states. Now there will be different rights. There can be different rights in each state, but when you move from one state to the other, you're given the full set of rights of that state. They may be different, but you have equal access to the full rights of the state when you move between states. Right. It also creates, in Article number 5, a Congress of the Confederation known as the United States in Congress assembled. And each state only has one vote in the Congress, right? So votes within Congress came down to one vote per state. That's it. That was how the central government was to function. And oddly enough, that's how the constitutional, right, the Congress of the continent, the Continental Congress, throughout the war functioned, right? The one that John Hancock ran, right? That's how it functioned. Article number 6 says that only the central government was allowed to declare war or conduct foreign or political commercial relations. So foreign policy was to be conducted together, whereas all internal politics were left to the states. The states themselves, whenever there was an army, would assign colonels, and below for officers, generals were to be assigned by the national government. All right, number 8 is really kind of the key here. Right? The 8th point of the Articles of Confederation is that funds will be raised by state legislatures and then paid to the central government. So there's no real, right, it's almost like donations as opposed to taxation power. That's going to be the key, right? The weak central government of the Articles of Confederation has no taxation power. And if you don't have taxation power, that means you can't raise money. And if you don't have money as a state, right, as a administrative body, you can't actually do stuff. And that's going to be a problem basically from the beginning. The rest of the articles, right, Articles 9 and 10 say exactly how Congress should function, right, what it can specifically do. Article 11, oddly enough, said that if Quebec decided to ever join the United States, it gets free admittance, or really Canada gets free admittance. So that's pretty nifty there. Everyone else has to get voted in. Number 12 says that the Confederation, right, the Articles of Confederation, the United States of America, are going to pay the war debts, well, all the debts that Congress had before the Articles showed up. And Article 13 says that it can only be altered with the approval of Congress and the ratification of all state legislatures. So that's how they were going to change it. So this institution that was created really has some major problems. Right, the initial institutions of our country were very weak. They were so weak, in fact, that the original president of the United States of America, who is not George Washington, right, the original president of the United States of America under the Articles of Confederation was John Hancock. He never showed up for the job. He realized that it was a sucker's job. He didn't want to run this. Right, he was tired from having run Congress for the preceding 10 years. So he decided to sit this one out. The president never showed up. And with that, right, that kind of shows the bigger problems that are going to be faced here. All right. This weak central government really couldn't do anything. And that was by design. Right? What you have to remember is that these are people that had just fought a war against a strong centralized government. And they did not want this for themselves, right? Generally speaking. Now, some of them perhaps would have wanted more power, and some of them will want more power. But right from the get-go, they did not want to create a powerful, strong institution. They thought that the best way to secure the liberty that they had just won was to give power closer to the people, right? Rest authority in the states. Sovereignty should rest in the states was their original idea. But they immediately faced some severe political problems. You'll notice that I've got something up here that says Shays Rebellion. This could also say Whiskey Rebellion. There are two major rebellions that occur right off the bat in the creation of the Articles of Confederation. Shays Rebellion was created by a Massachusetts farmer by the name of Daniel Shays, who had been fighting in the War of Independence. Right? He was a good soldier, but he didn't get paid for his work. Right? And many other soldiers hadn't been paid as well. So they got together and they started a rebellion. They wanted to overthrow the government to fix their economic and social injustices that had already emerged. So the United States, right, the central government, wanted to fight it off. Now, here's the thing. They didn't have any taxation authority. They didn't really have the ability to raise an army, much less pay them, right? That was the problem to begin with. So it was only through essentially George Washington talking these people down, right, that they were able to quench this rebellion. It was a big problem, right? Because it created a crisis of government. So in response to Shays' rebellion and the weakness of the federal, well, it wasn't even a federal government at this point. It was just the central government of the United States. There was a crisis, so they rallied Congress together in an attempt to amend the Articles, like it says in Article 12. But along the way, they realized that it was just plain not workable to try to rework the Articles of Confederation. They were too broken. They needed something new. So they, in secret, decided to create a new constitution. They decided to overthrow the government that they had already just created. Now, it was the people who had created the government that wanted to overthrow it. But, I mean, that's still technically treason, right? If they hadn't succeeded in writing this new constitution, right, they had already committed treason against the UK. Right, they're committing a little bit of treason again. But remember, it's only treason if you lose, right? That's an important thing to remember. So the primary players at this point in time were people like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, right, and John Adams, right? These founding fathers, right, come together to address the problems of the Articles of Confederation, right? It's not Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's not there. Thomas Jefferson's in France. Richard Henry Lee, who is also against kind of these changes, big fan, right? One of the founding fathers. He was off, right, dealing with the Germans, right? So there's some stuff going down. There's some players missing. So these founding fathers get together to once again negotiate a new form of government instituted among the states to better function within this system. So the Confederacy failed, right? The Articles of Confederation failed in large part due to the weakness of the central government, right? It made all states sovereign and co-equal without any sort of central authority, right? So it couldn't really even defend itself, right? It was meant to be a mutual defense government, but it couldn't even do that. At the same time, there were also massive issues that emerged between interstate trade, right? Trade between Georgia and Virginia, right? There were major trade issues, right? States began to levy taxes between each other, which they weren't supposed to do. But again, the central government didn't have the ability to do that. So this left a major opening, a major weakness in the institutional type, right? Allowing for a new, better institution to come about, right? A more centralized institution. So I'm going to leave us there for this week, right? That's where we're going to stop, right? That's where this module stops. And when we come back for our next module, when we come back for the next unit, we're going to dig into this notion of federalism and how the Constitution, right, our federal constitutional democratic republic is created and what it's meant to do, right? And the key features of this unique federal system that we created in the United States, right? How that came to be, which, spoiler, is in large part a response to the problems as were created, right, by the Articles of Confederation. So your next steps. After watching this video, which is the first thing you should do for every lesson, watch the lecture, watch the video. Then do the readings, right? Get a little bit deeper background. Figure out how all this stuff fits together even more, right? See if there are bigger, right, things going on. I would recommend reading the chapter as provided in the BVT publishing book, the Turner et al. But otherwise, if we're going to switch to an open textbook, right, read about kind of the origins of the country, right? This really should be the first chapter in any American politics textbook that you open up. So that's where we're going to leave it for today. After you watch this video, which you should have just finished, done the reading, go about taking your quiz, right? That's the next thing you should do. And then after that, right, we'll move on to the next module, right? The next module will open up beginning of next week. So, I guess it's now time to land this. So I'm going to bid you goodbye to the lecture.